God, let this time be helpful and fruitful. We continue to give you thanks that we are part of a community, and a community that wants to know its story and tell your story, and in particular that celebrates its reforming heritage. And so thank you for all these folks that want to hear more about Luther and the Reformation, and let it be a blessing to them in Jesus' name. Amen. So, over 100 people at the Luther movie the other night. Good witness. I had a lot of people. Give yourself a 110. Thank you, Darcy. They did give us a little discount because of the quality issue that we had, but I thank you for being patient with that. Really enjoyed it. Thought the acting was actually really good, and any movie like that is going to have weaknesses and strengths. But it was just exciting to have a lot of people walk around the corner and see the entire theater full, and they were like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe there's all these people there." So anyway, great witness for our community too. So that was a lot of fun. So let's jump into where we're at in our story. Remember, I'm a curator, not a scholar. I'm collecting, organizing, and presenting information for you. So we have been to lots of places in these 15 sessions that we've already had. And we reviewed Erasmus and Luther's big debate that they had with each other last week, so we won't review that. But just remember that Luther and Erasmus kind of supported Luther in some of the reforms, but then Karlstadt and Munzer were more radical reformers than Luther, and so what you want to get is that at this stage in the Reformation, Luther's critiquing and criticizing the Roman Church, but he's also now got people on the other side. Sorry, I don't know why the microphone's cutting out. We can't find the right channel here, but anyway, we've got people on his left, if you will, more radical reformers that are doing things that Luther feels are wrong. So Luther's got folks on both sides that he's struggling with. I just want to tell you a little note about this Karlstadt person. Those of you who saw the movie saw the person playing Karlstadt, and I thought they overdid it a little bit with Karlstadt. He was more like the Munzer, who was really a radical person in the way he thought the Reformation should advance. But I wanted to tell you a little something that most people don't know about Luther's relationship with the Karlstadt family, because we hear all these official things and positions, but I like to give you some of the human stuff that behind the scenes that we know happened. So when Martin and Katie were married in 1525, by this time Luther and Karlstadt have, they've had their conflict. Karlstadt has gone off to preach in other places. Things haven't gone well for him. So right like a few days after Luther and Katie are married, and now they're living in the Augustinian monastery, the monastery that used to be a monastery, now it's Luther and Katie's house. A few days after that, guess who shows up with not a penny to their name, but the Karlstadt family. So Andreas Bodenstein von Karlstadt, I love that name. This is a picture of him as a younger person. Remember, he was the professor in Wittenberg before Luther, and really gravitated to what Luther was saying, was a big supporter of Luther at first, but then went further than Luther, wanted to be more radical and much more forceful in making change happen than Luther did, and moving much quicker than Luther wanted to move. So anyway, so he's struggling, and he shows up to the Luther house. Big conflict with Luther. I mean, this is a big falling out, a big issue. This is the actor in the movie, so if you saw the Luther movie just this last week, this is the guy that was playing Karlstadt. And this is what happens. they need help. And so Martin and Katie, newlyweds as they are, take his entire family, multiple children, into their house. Of course, they would end up having 40 people staying at their house sometimes. And Martin was, you know, he really depended on Katie a lot, put a lot of pressure there, because he'd just invite pretty much anybody and everybody over all the time. But it's pretty astonishing that they did this, given the big conflict that they had. And not only that, Luther then negotiates with Frederick to get a place for Karlstadt to live, and for his family to live. So 8 weeks they stayed at the Luther house, you know, newlyweds. Okay, well, anyway. And then he makes sure that there's a place for him. I think that's pretty cool. You know, with Luther's hot, you know, personality, and you know, but here, an enemy of his, he made sure would be taken care of. How does Karlstadt? Where does he go? He takes up farming, and he becomes a farmer, which is kind of amazing and cool. So that's just a little tidbit most people will never tell you, or unless you really dig down into some of the biographies, you wouldn't see. And I just wanted to let you know that. Finally, if you think that was enough, guess who sponsors Karlstadt's kids? The Karlstadt Jr. Andreas Karlstadt Jr., Luther and Katie are the sponsors for Karlstadt's kid. So isn't that something? That kind of divisiveness, but yet reconciliation could happen around the Reformation. So remember, this is where we were last week. We've been talking about the Holy Roman Empire and all of these various states. So here's Saxony right here, where Prince Frederick was in charge of that area. We're going to talk a little bit about what was going on in Bohemia today. Bugenhagen was from Pomerania up here. The guy that would become Luther's pastor, really. You've got Albert of Mainz, the guy that was selling the indulgences to raise, you know, to pay off his debt to be, you know, archbishop and stuff. This is Mainz right here. I know you can't see it that well. So these are estates. Worms is way down here. So it's a pretty big distance. But anyway, I wanted to just remind you of that. And then of those various states, there were 7 electors that elected the emperor. So Frederick was one of those. After, right around when Frederick dies, these folks, and this is a little review again, all of these leaders of these various territories get together, in the north in particular, because they are starting to adopt Reformation ideas. They want evangelical preachers, preachers that are, you know, preaching faith, you know, by grace through faith alone, not by works. They want these preachers, they want these folks, and so they're starting, they kind of make decisions for their areas, like, are we going with the Reformation? Are we going with Rome? More of the leaders in the south go with Rome than the north. And so this group of folks in the north got together at the Diet of Speyer. Remember we talked about this last week? And Charles, the emperor, can't be there or isn't there, probably because of his work with the Turks and other things. And so he sends a representative. They don't have any success in resolving the issue. Then they reconvene in 1529, and Charles sends a letter in which I think it was somebody in his family that was representing him, and saying, hey, make reconciliation, we have to resolve this, but it doesn't reach him in time, and so this person says, no, you guys have to recant all of your ways, and the leaders bring forth a list of their protests, and that's where the word, as you learned last week, Protestant comes from the Diet of Speyer, which had a 3-year break, recess. So they, you know, they waited another 3 years after 1526. So anyway, that's important for you to know, because that will set the stage for the Augsburg Confession and the Diet of Augsburg. How many of you saw the movie on this last Friday night? How many of you there? So the movie jumps really quickly to the Diet of Augsburg. But when Philip Melanchthon comes riding back, you know, we gave our list of, you know, confessions and stuff. he's coming back from the Diet of Augsburg, where these princes, I guess you could say, some of the electors and some of the other leaders of these territories stood up to Charles and said, no, we're not going to throw in the towel on the Reformation, and we're not going to surrender God's word. And so now, I tell you all of that to tell you this, that the Reformation, a theological concept and concepts, now start to make their way into the temporal realm, in the realm of governments and leadership and administration. And so what we're going to do today, after we revisit Luther's, a little bit of stuff I said last week about the Turks and Luther, is give you some information about how the Reformation started to get administrated, what issues they had to deal with, and how do you start being a new church when we're no longer connected to Rome and all of their infrastructure and all of their support. So that's what we're going to work on. I hope it won't be too boring for you, because it's administration. So when you came here, I want to listen. I love administration. So remember, just again, review, because I found that review is really important. People need to hear things a number of times. That one of the reasons the Reformation can start to happen and these states can start to become independent from Rome and the empire is because Charles has bigger fish to fry, so to speak. He has bigger problems, and one of those was the onslaught of the Ottoman Empire, of the Turkish armies who were invading Europe and conquering Europe. Constantinople is conquered about 75 years before Luther's life, and so all of Europe is on edge because of this invasion. And so this keeps Charles occupied. Luther was asked, and this is what we worked on last week, to say, what do you think about this problem? And so I just want to review what he said. I was a little nervous after what I said last week. I don't want any misunderstandings to come from what I said. So here we go. Luther says that really the response to the Turks comes in, not surprising, two different fronts, two kingdoms. He said the emperor needs to defend the Holy Roman Empire, and Christians are totally bound as, he probably didn't use the word citizens, but as people of this empire to fight, to go to war. It's totally okay for Christians to go to war and defend the empire and defend, from this onslaught. But when they do that, what Luther objected to, which I found to be really refreshing, amazing, and very contemporary, here he lived 500 years ago, and after he was right on the heels of all the Crusades, that you don't do that in the name of Christ. You don't do it as a Christian. This is not a holy war. He said, no way. You do it as a citizen of your country, and you find that's the responsible thing. But don't take the cross into battle and say, this is Jesus. He objected to that very strongly. So he said on the temporal side, we have to fight as citizens, and it's Charles's responsibility to defend our empire, I guess you could say. But when we do that, we don't do it in kind of a holy war thing. And we certainly don't do it with any promise that I'm going to get out of purgatory if I go and fight against the Islam and all of this. He totally objected to that, which I think was really cool. But he didn't just say it's no problem. So then he would say that we need to fight this fight on a spiritual realm. He didn't use the word spiritual, but that's in essence what he's saying. What should Christians do? One, repent. Because in Luther's day, he believed that the Turks were kind of God's judgment. The reason that these folks are having success is because we have so little regarded the gospel and all the corruption and all this, and we need to get our act together and God will defend us. That was Luther's mindset. He lived 500 years ago. That's what he was thinking. So one, we need to repent, get our house in order. But two, then he would say, well, this is my problem with Islam. And it was theological. He just went right down the list. How do they view Christ? How works righteousness? They check off all the boxes. our kids, as we've been trying to, make respectful dialogue and model that here. A number of years ago, Pastor Jonathan took a group of our kids to the mosque in Tacoma, and it was a great visit, but those folks were very, they were not, oh, it's okay what you believe about Jesus and what we believe, everything's happy. No, they were like, you guys need to be doing this, or you're not going to be it. And that's what they believe, and that was great. And we had some great conversations. For instance, I had great conversations with my daughter at the time in the youth group about the Trinity, because Muslims don't believe in the Trinity, and that's their big offense. Jesus is not God. And for us to say Jesus is God is an absolute blasphemy. So they have issues. And then, of course, for us, Islam will say Jesus was a great prophet. He might even have been raised from the dead. All this, but he's not God. For us, that's tough to swallow too, right? So Luther's going to just say, no, we've got to battle Islam in the realm of ideas and theology. So then the question, that's what he said. And that was 500 years ago, totally different situation in many respects to ours today, where we live in this I'm talking about this country, where we live in a pluralistic society, and we have lots of Muslims who are good citizens of this country, and all of that. And Islam is very diverse. You think Christianity is diverse, Islam is very diverse as well. At least that's been my experience. But the question comes is, how do we appropriate Luther's words today? I told you last week, and this is the nervous part, that Luther believed that really what's behind Islam is the devil, because, they're degrading Christ. But he also said that about the Pope, and, he said that about a lot of people. So it's not just, Islam or something. So, that's the way people talk today. I, for instance, wouldn't stand up and say, well, the devil's behind Islam. I wouldn't say that. I don't think that's helpful. But at the same time, I would say, let's talk about who Jesus is. And let's love each other when we're done. I am not, as you probably come to know, I am not a postmodern person. I don't believe any truth is as good as any other truth. Sorry. I believe Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But what I did say last week, which I was happy about, is we can work with Muslims in making the world a more just place. We can work with them in lots of ways. We can work with people of all different religions. We can work with people of no religion out there and loving our neighbor. But I also don't think we should give up on the dialogue. When I was in Ethiopia, Christians in Ethiopia and Muslims, fortunately, they were not, and Ethiopia kept ISIS out and that kind of more radical, expression, which a lot of people don't even want to count as Islam. I get that, but a very violent, radical part. They've been able to keep that by and large out of their country. But the Wahhabi Muslims are there from Saudi Arabia, very well financed. They basically, if you become Muslim, you've got a job for life. In Ethiopia, this is kind of the way they make converts. They're trying to convert people, and Christians are trying to convert people. And I found that refreshing, truthfully. They're not killing each other. They have respectful dialogue. They've had conversation about how we live together. But they still are trying to share Christ, even with Muslims. I talked to one man who was a Muslim who became a Christian, and he was actually rejected. He struggled in both the Christian and the Muslim community because his name was Muhammad. And he kept his name, but he became a Christian, so he was completely rejected by his Muslim community, family. He was out. But Christians looked at him like, so it was really fascinating. But he was absolutely committed to Christ, and it was really an interesting story. So that's what I really wanted to get you to think about is, well, how do we... Luther is just a man, but it was interesting. No holy war. If you fight in like a war, you're fighting as a citizen of your country or temporal realm. You're not doing this on behalf of Christ. So Luther's two kingdoms understanding there. I think that's important. This was Luther's ultimate issue with Islam. Just like when when he says the papists, the Roman Catholic Church of his time, was totally focused on works. He saw the same exact system in Islam. So that's one thing I want to say, whether it's the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints or Islam or whatever, what I want you to wrestle with is, are Lutheran faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone? These alones are the marker of the Lutheran Reformation. We're going to preach on them all of October. But there's lots of religions that are faith plus works. You got to have them together. There's lots of religions. In fact, most of human religions are that way, whether it's Hindu or other religions. So that's a thing that we, have to be and wrestle with. And how do we appropriate that in this world today is really interesting. So, I was going to have you talk about that, but I've talked too long in reviewing today. So, we're going to move. So that was last week. I just wanted to reiterate some things. So let's move today to administration. Exciting, yes. I know about that. I know you do. Okay, so practical matters. How do you take care of pastors? Wait a minute. We're in these Reformed cities, and now they're no longer supported by Rome. Do you know that a lot of the evangelical pastors had to throw in the towel because they were starving to death? They had no source of help, no source of income, because now they were outside of Rome. But now who's going to take care of them? Well, this is the kind of stuff we have to think about. Listen to what Luther says here, and it's kind of a long section, so you probably can't see it all, but I want to read it all. But law is law. People talk, but do not act. For just as the people of Moses neglected this law and did not support its priests and Levites, so that these men were forced either to leave the word and worship of God and take up some manual labor, or to set up new doctrines or idolatries. For here the people richly supported its seducers and neglected the true shepherds, because they also turned away from the truth to fables. So it happens now. No one supports the servants of the word. For want of bread, they are forced to leave the ministry and become farmers and ply trades. While the godless seducers have not only been fed, but have filled the world with bishoprics and monasteries equal to the wealth of kings and princes. So, what Luther sees is, boy, Rome, look at those priests are fat and happy, and they've got all this stuff, and protesting, the evangelical pastors now are like just dying for a loaf of bread. So, it is a judgment of God that those who have not given and do not give to the ministry of God, minister of God, and messenger of salvation, one loaf of bread wastes whole kingdoms and principalities on the servants of Satan and the messengers of death. In other words, what is Luther saying here? He's saying, if you want the gospel, if you want this evangelical word, you're going to have to support it. Not just with your mind, but with your pocketbook. Interesting. So, he would, because of this, he would start to get involved with some of the leaders of these various territories. Like, what are you doing? You can't let these pastors be hungry. And so he went both to the people and the government. Sometimes the pastor was paid through a communal chest. Remember, we talked about this before the summer break, that Luther invented the concept of the community chest, where you had all these various keys held by different leaders, and everybody put money in, and when someone was poor and they were struggling, you got together and you took from the community chest and helped people out. Well, sometimes the pastor was paid enough to eat that way. But everything's up for grabs at this point. How are we going to organize ourselves? And so, with that, the other issue came on: how do we choose our leaders? Who's going to be the bishop? Because wait, the Pope, took care of who the bishop was in the past, and then the bishops ordained the priests and everything, and they assigned priests to go and be. Now who's going to be our bishop? Who's going to be our priest? Who's going to be the bishop of the bishops, the archbishop? Who's going to administer this issue? Let's listen to what Luther says here. It's another longer section, but this is really fascinating. And then we're going to stop and have you talk about it. It's not necessary, I think, to put this form of election immediately into practice in the Diet of Bohemia as a whole. Okay, so let me set this up. So the folks in Bohemia, remember that state a little bit to the south, east of Saxony, they were like wrestling with this. How are we going to have pastors? I mean, how are we going to decide who's pastor, who's not? And so there's a thought of, what did he say? Election? That the people are going to elect their pastor? Whoa. What are you talking about, Luther? But if individuals, so they're talking about this, but notice his tactic. But if individual cities adopt it for themselves, the example of one will soon be followed by another. The Diet might well consider whether this form should be adopted by all of Bohemia, or if one part might accept and another part postpone decision, or even reject it altogether. So now, Luther's not only saying we're going to have different areas, parishes, if you will, elect their pastor, but we're going to let those areas decide. That's a lot of freedom, isn't it? But that's what he's saying. In other words, we're not going to force this legislation on people. Let's see. For none should be forced to believe. We must give freedom and honor to the Holy Spirit that he may move whatever he will. Now I'll skip a section. As the venture succeeds with the help of the Lord, and many cities adopt this method of electing their bishops, then these bishops may wish to come together and elect one or more from their number to be their superiors, who would serve them and hold visitations among them, as Peter visited the churches according to the account in the book of Acts. Then Bohemia would return again to its rightful and evangelical archbishopric, which would be rich, not in large income and much authority, but in many ministers and visitation of the churches. So what do we get? What I want you to get here is Luther's having to get into the world of administration. How do we have bishops? Who we elect them? How do we decide who's going to be a pastor? Who appoints them? And what we see is kind of a hybrid of the religious and the secular rulers working together. Some historians will say that this is where the door got opened to churches having a religion be the religion of the country, like Norway, right? Luther, and who pays the pastor's salary in Norway, even to this day? Yeah, right. Now, in Germany, it's the same way, although I was corrected with this, because, anyway, there's some fine-tuning, and they say, no, it's not really true, but I think that's where their check comes from. So, anyway, and so a lot of people say, oop, this was a bad compromise. This opened the door to this practice that's not really been, at least as far as what's happened in Europe with Christianity, not been very helpful. What do you make of this? What application? Okay, for how we elect pastors, our bishops, how do we get leaders for our area, and how do we pay for people who are ministers of the word? How does that work? What application does it have? Luther would go to John the Steadfast, who was the person who was the elector after Prince Frederick died, and he is, I believe, Frederick's nephew. And John the Steadfast, whereas Prince Frederick stayed out of the religious matters completely, John the Steadfast, he gets really involved, and Luther gets him involved, and he starts meddling in the church stuff, and then everything gets kind of mixed up a little bit. Meddling might not be the right word. He's asked to intervene and start doing some things because now we don't have Rome and that authority system. So he gets more involved. I'm going to skip this quote. I want you to work for a minute. What ways might these situations and Luther's counsel apply to us today? how do we choose pastors? Where does authority come from? How do we support the work of the church? Turn and let's do a little table talk. If you're with just one other person, that's fine. Or if you're in a group of 4, that's perfect. Or if you want to circle around and make a group of 3. What do you make of this? What do you make of this struggle to how we're going to be the church? How we're going to administer the sacraments? Talk for a minute about what application does this have to us today? So, man, I hate to interrupt your great conversation because I see some great things happening. Hey, can anybody feel comfortable sharing some application or insight from your small group thing or something that came up and you thought, wow, that was on target? How do we apply what some of these principles or what application or relevancy do they have to us today? Strengths, weaknesses, whatever. Don in the back? Yeah. It's okay. It's going to come out.
I don't like talking.
Yeah.
Our verse was about how, I know theology divides into our current denominations, but it came to mind that some of our denominations are by managerial levels.
Yes.
And for us, we're talking, not only does it split churches, but it's also regained churches in the case of the ALC and LCA.
Yeah.
Trying to decide on how do we re-merge rather than split.
Yeah.
But I got thinking too that in Luther's day, we didn't start out after Christ with a pope. We started getting people involved, people started gaining power and wealth, and it evolved into a top-heavy organization that Luther fights against, and we find ourselves sort of evolving through time into something similar where people's view and their control. And then we also talked about how we also like certainty. So divesting ourselves of decision making and electing someone who can tell us how to pray.
Yeah.
And to tell us what to do.
Right. Yeah. Boy, you said a lot there. That is really good.
My wife says they do that a lot.
Yeah. Well, there's some great stuff there, Don. I guess I want to bounce off it in a couple ways. Lutherans are interesting because we are founded on a confession of faith and not a type of administration. That's been both our strength and our weakness. Should we have bishops? Should we have presidents? How should we do ordination? It's been, what works? And that's led to a lot of chaos. But it's also maybe led to some freedoms, like you mentioned the ALC and the LCA. One of the big struggles between those two was polity. I mean, there are lots of differences, but people tended to say ALC was a confederation of congregations, and the LCA was more of what we have today, where more of a link, more of a congregate. We're the big church, and then we are small congregations that are part of it. And the ALC had more of a congregational focus. I think that might be true to say. I grew up in Missouri, so they were very congregational. But then we've got movements that came out of, in reaction to, like in Norway, you had the state church, much later downstream from Luther, but as the Lutheran Church became the state church of Norway, then there was a movement of pietism that said, no, we reject that top-down thing. And so we've had these tensions ever since. And this is where I guess I want to say also that there are a lot of people, we're celebrating the Reformation, we're talking about how good, there's a lot of people in the world that think this was a disaster for the church. I think we should acknowledge that. That there's a lot of ambivalence about whether this was a good thing or not. And I just think we should acknowledge that. Please, Don.
Yeah, the irony about pastors in Germany.
Yes.
We had German interns, and they thought our model of being a pastor was absolutely terrific, because in Germany they are doing administration all the time. They bury, they baptize, they marry, and and they said they had no time to do pastoral counseling, they had no time to mix with people.
Wow.
But being a pastor here, they thought was just heavenly.
Yes.
They also reminded me that you don't have to pay the church tax in Germany.
Yes.
But the problem is you'll have no place to be buried when you die.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. That's, you don't have to, but you won't have a place to be buried. Yeah. I see another bit in the back there. Can we go back to Tim? Excellent. Thank you, John. That's really helpful.
That's a number of years.
You know, the question of authority or pastoral leadership
Yes.
in the church brings to mind John Wembley's visit
Yeah.
last year. And,
Yes.
and where we're all confused, oh, excuse me, we all have different experiences. The pastor's role in a church, say, of 100 people is different than a pastor's role in a church of 200 or 500.
Right.
And so, which is right?
Yeah.
The answer is it all depends.
Yes. Exactly.
So
Yeah.
there are different
What's
demands
needed?
on our leaders due to the size of
Yeah.
the association.
Great point. What's needed? What's helpful? What works in this situation? Got there, and then come up here to the front. Yeah.
Well, it occurred to me that you were outlining the whole administration thing, and it's like a form of democracy
Yes.
starting. And yet, today we see all of these splintering off of the main denominations and this kind of thing.
Yep.
I'm not so sure that's just not a way of breaking us up, and then Christianity reignites. It's like a big bonfire, the sparks go out, and somebody throws something in the middle, boom. And so breaking up and reforming, I think, is part of God's plan.
Yeah. Good. Helpful. Yeah. Please.
In our own experience here at Silverdale, it's generally true in the Lutheran congregation, regardless of sentence. When we call a pastor, we basically go through the election process.
Yes.
So we have a committee of members, and the committee works with the bishop, and names are secured. These are people that come with having met certain standards and credentials.
Yeah.
And then we as a congregation consider names, and we make a recommendation, and the congregation comes together and elects.
Yes.
And so, going to Luther's point, we've chosen the election process.
Right. Yeah.
And so, that's what we apply today.
Yes.
In this, so.
Great connection. We're living this out today.
Living it out today,
Yeah. And that's the way our bishops are elected.
but other churches have chosen to do it differently.
That's
Appoint
correct.
pastors to go, whatever.
That's right.
And
Methodist
it ties
Church,
into the
Catholic.
state.
Yeah.
Well, you can make a choice, you don't have to force one way, but it helps to have some standard way of doing it.
Yes, right. And that's beautifully said. And, I think we should recognize there's more than one right way to do this, and lots of ways have strengths and weaknesses. I'm coming there. So, we elect our synod bishop, and then we have people from our synod assemblies that go to the national assembly, the church-wide assembly, and they elect the church-wide bishop. Now that's very different than Rome, right? So, but again, there's strengths and weaknesses both ways. Okay, so back there, yeah.
Well, we talked about it, or at least I introduced that Jesus came as God's son to kind of shake up the religious folks, and he was a rebel, and in their time, he was the rebel. Bringing people, his mission was to bring people closer to God, to have a closer relationship to his Father and himself through him.
Yep.
Well, so 1,500 years, I'm just thinking that Martin Luther was used mightily to do the same thing in his time, which was to bring people closer to God and have that direct relationship.
Yeah.
And I am surprised that in what we've learned, I haven't read any of the books that you have read, but I'm surprised that in what you've presented so far, Luther hasn't said one of Jesus' famous quotes from, what do we pay Rome and what do we pay to the temple?
Yeah.
And that he hasn't said to them, now's the time, step up, because give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's.
That's a text that Luther would use to support his two kingdoms kind of thinking. But I think you're right to compare Luther to Jesus in that regard, that Luther, I think, as I've read a lot of Martin Luther, and he's not Jesus, of course, so I'm not comparing him that way, but
Not even calling him a prophet.
yeah, he was definitely more concerned about people's consciences and their relationship to God than the position he had or the position others had. He would say those positions have a purpose. But as all institutions, this is where your comment I think is really helpful, all institutions, including Pastor Bill and Silverdale Lutheran, the temptation is to what? We start thinking about self-preservation, right? Well, we got to keep the building going, and we start to think, but wait a minute, it isn't the building that's our mission, it's connecting people to Christ. So I exist for a reason, you exist for a reason, and Luther would probably say the hierarchy and the power structure got focused on itself rather than its mission. But that happens all the time, and we always have to deal with that tension. Great comment. I saw another back here. Yeah?
After his falling out with the Pope, do we get insight into what Luther anticipated? It's almost like he didn't quite see what was next.
Well,
Organizationally.
that's what he's doing right now, is starting to put together, okay, how is the reform going to go on from here? So they're hard at that now. But also know Luther thought that the end of the world was going to come at any time. So he had an eschatology, he had a belief that, the Pope, he had concluded at the beginning, he thinks the Pope will listen and, let's have this debate. You saw that in the movie, which I think was accurately portrayed. And he gives up on that, and then starts calling the Pope the Antichrist, and it gets real ugly and colorful, I guess you could say. And then the Pope, of course, is condemning him as a heretic, and so all the arrows are flying, and Luther gives up on that. By this time, he's pretty much thrown in the towel, and they're starting to go, okay, how do we make this keep going? And the electors, or not just the electors, but the leaders of the various areas, they're going, Charles is going to invade. He's going to enforce the Edict of Worms, which remember was not just against Luther, but anybody who agrees with him. He's going to come and get us. We got to get together. And they form what's called the Schmalkaldic League. And after Luther dies, it's by that time Charles is at a place where he can militarily take this on, and he invades and defeats the Schmalkaldic League. And it's a big war in the whole business. Although most people, if you looked at the Schmalkaldic League and what Charles had, Charles evidently was a brilliant military guy. Charles would have been the underdog, but he wins. And they come into Wittenberg, destroy Luther's garden and house. The Pope wants Charles to dig up Luther's grave in the Catholic Church. And Charles says, I only deal with living people, and doesn't do it. So that's why Luther's grave is still in the Catholic Church today. Because so they're starting to think of how do we make this Reformation happen politically, and of course Charles comes in, and anyway, it goes from there. Excellent. Other comments? You did well. Good job. I was fast, Dave. I appreciate your comment that, wow, we see the results of this today. We elect pastors. Now, some congregations are completely independent, right? They just choose their own pastor. But in our system, which I think is a cool system, we do this in partnership with the wider church. And seminaries. So seminaries train pastors. The synod has a candidacy committee. They look at that pastor. They're charged with, is this person fit for ministry? Theologically, psychologically, leadership-wise. And of course, all of this is a broken system, and none of this is perfect. And then a congregation calls a pastor. And you, as I've said many times, in the Lutheran Church, you are not a pastor until you have a call. When I graduated from seminary, I had an MDiv. That was it. When I was approved by the synod, thank you, I'm approved to be a pastor. But I'm not a pastor until a local congregation calls me. So going right back to Luther's you should let the people decide. But I also love that he said, don't force people to do it. Give them some freedom. Let the Holy Spirit work. Now, talk about chaos, but that's what he wanted. So it's interesting. Okay, excellent work. We've got about 10 minutes. I want to just stir you up some more today. And now, you heard in that last quote from Luther that the bishops and the pastoral leaders should be out visiting. Don, you mentioned that the pastors in Germany don't have any time for that type of stuff. They're just doing these administrative tasks. Luther wanted to know, what is the status of this Reformation? What do people know out there? What do they believe? He thought that was really important, and so now he wants to know, and so they embark on a system of visitations to go out and see what's going on. What do people believe? How are the priests doing, the pastors in their individual churches? Are people excited about this Reformation? What Luther will struggle with is the same thing Lutheran churches still struggle with, is that a lot of people heard the evangelical gospel, you're saved by grace through faith, it's a gift, you don't have to earn it anymore, it's a free gift. And people are like, oh goody, see ya. They're not even paying their pastors. The pastors who are preaching are starving to death. So Luther gets kind of upset about this. At one point, I forget which writing, and I didn't quote it here, he says that his German people, his Wittenberg congregation is like a cow staring at a new gate.
That's good.
It's like he's like, don't you get the gift you've got? I mean, so he, it's interesting when you set people free from one thing, they don't necessarily, so this will be an ongoing struggle for him. So when Luther goes out to visit the various areas around Wittenberg and in the various different territories, to see the status of evangelical preaching and the reforms, he is totally shocked by what he finds. Lay people know nothing of the faith. Priests know not much more. They know how to say a mass in Latin, and that's about it. That the status has just gotten so poor, and that lights a fire in Luther. At one point, Luther wants to write a catechism, a teaching method, and people are encouraging to do it. He's encouraging others to do it, like Bugenhagen, who was kind of Luther's pastor, and then Justus Jonas and John Agricola. These are people, Luther felt that actually every pastor should write a catechism for their congregation. Everybody should embark on, what's the basics of the Christian faith. So my basics class, I don't know if Luther would like what I said, but I think he'd like that we did, and we do it. You need to educate your people, and you know what, here's the key thing. If you're going to give them the power to elect pastors, it's probably good that they know a little something about the faith, right? So Rome would look at it and say, you can't entrust those lay people with that responsibility. I had one Lutheran administrator tell me that a few years ago when we were having debates about the ELCA. And you can't let congregations decide. I mean, how would you know they do the vote right? How would you know this and that? Because see, I want to have congregations ratify everything that the national church says. Sorry, I'm ratifying. I just think it should be a check and balance like we have in our government. Presbyterian church has it. Anyway. So I was thinking, you can't lay people, congregations, you can't let them go. Yeah, I'd be okay with that. So, if you're going to give them that power and authority, they've got to know the Christian faith. So, catechisms were not new, but Luther embarks on this, and he starts preaching catechetically and on the catechism and the various traditional parts of the catechism. And then after a series of sermons, he writes, what are they called? Small catechism and the large catechism. Small catechism he wrote for parents to use to teach their children, their little ones. It's interesting that in the history of the Lutheran movement, that the small catechism became the curriculum for confirmation, which is fine and good, and it's still a part of our work. But it was never designed for the pastors to teach. It was designed for who? In fact, the small catechism first comes out in big pamphlet form. You know, like we've got the little books. And the first printings of the small catechism were these big pamphlets, and families put them up in their house. They didn't have refrigerators, but you know, it was that type of thing. Then he wrote the large catechism for you and for pastors. And we're going to, next week, read some of the small and large catechism. We can't delve way down because we can do a 2-year class just on the catechism. But we're going to expose you a little bit. What I want to end today with is shock you a little bit. How important is this to Luther? Does he think this is like on a 1 to 10, you know, like a 5? You know, how important is this? Let me show you how important Luther thought it was. Now, this is the guy that says you're saved by grace through faith, you know, justified by grace. It's a gift. You don't earn it. All of this. Did that mean that Luther was like what we call an antinomian? You know, do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. You know, you're saved by grace. So, you know, let's see what Luther says here. Now, again, he's 500 years ago. We have to translate. We have to bring him into modern times. You know, just like we do with the Bible, we've got this hermeneutical gap we got to deal with. We've got to apply. But I just want you to read what he said in the intro to his sermons on the Catechism. Where did it? Oh, I know. It's so long. I had to just have it in my deal here. Okay, there we go. No? There we go. Okay, introduction. These portions which you have heard me recite were called by the ancient fathers the Catechism. That is an instruction for children, which the children and all who want to be Christians should know. And one who does not know them should not be counted among the number of Christians. Now, all of you who when you were confirmed and you had to, you know, testify in front of a board, where did that come from?
You had to memorize.
You had to memorize it. You had to memorize and then go like an inquisition.
Yes.
It was scary, turned a lot of kids off, etc. But at least know the motivation. Look at how serious Luther is about this. And for when a person does not know this, it is a sign that they have no regard for God in Christ. So Luther's going to say, if you're not in Pastor Bill's class and learning, if you're not in Sunday school, if you're not going to a Bible study, if you're not attending to your Christian education, do you really care about Christ? If you don't care to be educated about the faith? Well, maybe he was cranky this day. I don't know. Maybe he was having a bad day. Anyway, therefore I have admonished you adults to hold your children and servants and yourselves to this. Let me get up here. Otherwise we shall not admit you to Holy Communion. That's a hard one for me to stomach. You know, that's just so opposite. But you can see how serious Luther is about this. For if you parents and masters do not help, we shall accomplish little with our preaching. And if I preach all year long and the crowd only comes in and looks at the walls and windows of the church, it is of no use. Now, even though it's harsh, get what Luther's saying. He's saying, you know, come on parents, but he's saying, this is something that it's like we've got this new revelation. You can't just bring kids and drop them off at Sunday school. You can't just come and have God in the box and expect that your kids are going to believe. But we've had that. The pastor's the professional. Let's take it to the profession. Take them to the professional. They'll give them all the stuff. Then they'll be Christian out in the world. No. What is Luther saying 500 years ago? I can preach till I'm blue in the face, and if you guys don't do this stuff at home, it's going to mean nothing. Whoa. Is that ever powerful? Now, more intensity. person who wants to be a good citizen owes it to his family to urge them to learn these portions of the catechism. And if they will not, do not give them any bread to eat. So all of you poor people who were raked over the coals in catechism, you are forced to go, you can just blame Luther, okay? It's his fault. People were trying to take him seriously. Now, I don't have, see, this is the hermeneutical gap. I wouldn't advocate this today. You'd probably be, Child Protection Services would come. If the servants grumble, then throw them out of the house. This is where it's good we read Luther and know he's a German man of 500 years ago. I mean, he's a sainted sinner. But again, I want you to get at the underlying importance of how important Luther feels he is. Let's see, where did I leave? Throw them out. If you have children, train them to learn the Ten Commandments, the Creed, the Lord's Prayer. If you urge them diligently to do this, they will learn much in a year's time. But when they have learned this, there are many excellent passages scattered throughout Scriptures. These they should learn afterwards. If not at all, at least some of them. God has appointed you a master and a wife in order that you should hold your family to this. Notice the vocation of parent to pass the faith on. And you can do this easily enough by praying in the morning when you rise, in the evening when you go to bed, and before and after meals. Thus they will be brought up in the fear of the Lord. I am not saying this for nothing. I am determined that you shall not cast it to the winds. I should never have believed that you were such ignorant people if I didn't learn it every day. Say what you really think, Luther. Now this is what I highlighted this because I think this is cool. Every father of a family is a bishop in his house and the wife a bishopess. That's pretty amazing. Therefore, remember that you, if in your homes, are to help us early on in the ministry as we do in the church. If we do this, we shall have a gracious God who will defend us from all evil and in all evil. So, this sounds a little works righteousness, but really it's not. Luther's saying, you got to know the faith. You got to know the gospel. And whose responsibility is it? It's one-to-one. It's in that family. Now, I know that there's a lot of parents out here whose kids no longer go to church. You did some of this. You did your best. This is not easy. We have to translate from back 500 years ago to today. But I think what I take from this, trying to get at the spirit of it, is how do we have a calling to communicate the faith to our children in our hands. We still do a Sunday school here. We still have adult education. We want people to know Christ and to be educated in the faith, because to do that is to know Jesus and to know His grace and mercy. So Luther is like, he's astounded at how much no one knows anything, and I want to empower people to be the bishops of their family. So can you see in this how high Luther regarded laity, even though he kind of stuck it to him here? He regarded you as you have the ability to know the faith and teach the faith. You can do it. So anyway, there you go. Luther with no holds barred. Anyway, again, I think how we do this today is different than 500 years ago. That's a challenge. But we still have the call to do it. And thankfully, we're really wrestling with that. Jonathan and I and Paula and your church council, we wrestle with how do we communicate the faith to young people? How do we communicate the faith from cradle to the grave? How do we do faith formation in this culture this time? We're still working on that really hard, and I think that's great. So, next week we'll look a little bit at the catechisms. We'll also look at Luther's reforms of the German Mass, because now we got to figure out how we worship, now that we're separated from Rome too. Go in peace, serve the Lord. Thank you. I've got some wonderful Bibles up here, 100-year-old Bibles, German Bibles, carrying on the tradition of Luther. Berber's brought those in. Check out those. Got some great pictures up here. Feel free.